Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Genomics Lite. This is our big question session in our human genetic variation series. And tonight we're joined by Richard Milne, who'll be talking about ethical and societal implications associated with human genetic variation. In case you've not used Zoom webinar before, you'll have spotted that you can't use your camera or your microphone today. So if you need to ask us a question or get in touch with us, there's a little chat box at the bottom of the screen that you can click on. You can say hello to us and you can ask any sort of questions if you're having any tech issues. That's the best way to get in contact with us. If you've got sort of specific questions for Richard about his work or what he's talking about, you can also use the little Q&A box at the bottom of the screen as well. And that just helps us find all your questions when we have a little Q&A session later. We've also got closed captions on our call today. So if you want to turn subtitles on, there should be a little CC box at the bottom, and you should be able to turn subtitles on or off, whatever you find more useful. So I'm going to share my screen again and tell you a little bit more about the campus before I hand over to Richard. So as I said, this is the fourth in our series of human genetic variation. So we've looked at the context, we've looked at what it might be to study it in a lab, and we've looked at some careers. And so with Richard this evening, we're looking at some of the big questions. So both Richard and I work at the Wellcome Genome campus, and we're based just south of Cambridge in England. So my first question for you, if you can all find the chat box, is to let me know where in the world you are, because I always find it really interesting seeing where everybody's based this evening. Wow, we got a mix already. So we've got Cambridge, Leicester, Texas, Connecticut, California, back to Cambridge, Manchester, quite a lot in the States today. So welcome to everyone joining us from the States, and a lot from Cambridge as well. Awesome. So a pretty big mix from the UK and the US today. Awesome. And more from Scotland. Excellent. Awesome. So on the campus, we've got two main research groups. We've got the Wellcome Sanger Institute and EMBL EBI, and they have slightly different sort of focuses. So EMBL EBI works mainly and only with data, whereas the Wellcome Sanger Institute works with a mixture of data and sort of wet lab samples as well. But obviously everything that we're doing is related to genomics. So I've got a quick poll that I'm going to just ask how much you feel you know about genomics, and it's not to test you, it's just to give us an idea of who's in the room this evening, because we obviously can't see you. So this poll should jump up on your screen. If you can't see the poll but still want to tell us, you can use the chat box as well. Awesome. So we've got quite a mix, but quite a lot of people that are fairly, they feel like they know a good amount of genomics, which is nice to see. And so hopefully by the end of this session, you might have thought about a different side of genomics. We might not have learned more about genomics itself, but how it sort of interacts with society. So that's cool to see. Awesome. So on campus, we have lots of different research areas, and human genetic variation obviously impacts pretty much all of these. But obviously our human genetics area and our biodata area are the two big ones that link to these talks. Before I hand over to Richard, for anyone who's studying sort of A-levels, GCSEs, or I guess in the States if you're in high school, and you're looking for more resources to do with genomics, I definitely recommend checking out our Your Genome website. We've got articles, videos, stuff like that that will give you lots more information about anything to do with genomics. You can also subscribe to our education update. So this is the last in this series, and subscribing to this will let you know when our next series will be published. I'll put all these links and stuff in the chat in just a second as well. So I think that's all that I wanted to share before handing over. So I will stop sharing my screen and I will pass over to Richard.
Thank you very much, and hi everybody. I'll just try and get my my screen up and running. Okay. So hopefully you should be able to see my screen. Brilliant.
That's good.
Well, yeah. So thanks everybody for dialing in, and I hope you find what I've got to say interesting. Yeah. So my name is Richard Milne. I'm a sociologist these days, and I work, as Em said, just outside Cambridge at the Wellcome Genome campus. But when I was considering what I was going to do at university, and then when I did at university was initially biology. I started off wanting to study genetics. I started off in the lab. I wasn't particularly good at working in the lab. I was a dreadful pipetter, but particularly over time, I got really interested in not so much the questions that I could answer in the lab, but the kind of the bigger questions, I suppose, particularly which fits well with the theme of this afternoon, this evening, around the ethical and social questions that were being posed by new developments in genetics, particularly. Whether that's in Jurassic Park, it was also at the time of Dolly the cloned sheep, so the first cloned mammal. There was a lot of debate in Europe, particularly around the introduction of genetically modified crops, and that's debates that haven't really gone away in many ways. And then questions as well of whether, as we learned more about the human genome, as we learned about associating specific genes with specific characteristics, was it ethical? Was it legal? Was it acceptable for somebody or a company to own elements of those, to own a gene? And so all this was happening at the time that I was learning about biology and genetics, and it was increasingly clear that this science and all of the applications associated with it presented all these interesting questions beyond those that I was able to answer in the laboratory. So these are kind of like fundamental questions about, is this the right thing to do? Is it the right thing to do to clone an animal, to recreate dinosaurs at an extreme? What are the risks and benefits of doing these things? Fairly clear in the case of Jurassic Park, maybe less so in the case of genetically modified crops. And also, what does it mean to, like, the kind of very basic ideas of what we have about, what does it mean to say that something's natural? What does it mean to say something's artificial or it's being created? Who's going to benefit from all of this science and who might be harmed? And so these are the kind of questions around ethics and society that I've been basically working on ever since. These questions around what can we do, what should we do, what are the implications of doing these things, and who is it that makes the decisions about it, who is it that should be making the decisions. So yeah, so now I work here at the Wellcome Genome campus, which is primarily not a site for research in sociology, in ethics and philosophy. It's primarily a genomics and data research center, which is lucky because essentially those are the two areas that I'm the most interested in. So genomics, this question of the study of genes and our genetic material, what we inherit and what we pass on. And then questions about data. So I mean, big data is one of the really defining features of our time. We're constantly generating this stream of data about us as we use social media, as we use our mobile phones, as we move around the country, and as we go to the doctor, as our genomes are sequenced. All of this is information that's collected about us, that we make available about us, and that can tell other people something about us. Which brings me then to the third area of particular interest, which is people. I'm interested in how genomes and data, how they affect people, how they relate to people in the UK and around the world, and what people think about science and its implications. And ultimately, what we can learn from that in order to develop science that best serves a kind of global public need, how we might do that in the future. So one of the main things that I work on at the moment is public attitudes towards genetics. And so within our team at the Wellcome Genome campus, we've been doing this study over the last 3 or 4 years, and bringing together these questions about data and about genomes to ask what people think about genomic data. And we've been doing this study in 22 different countries. We've got it. We've been running it in 15 different languages, which of which I do not speak. Well, at least 13 of them, probably 14, and some people would say 50. But and we've been asking the same questions across these countries. And what I want to start off with, I think, to bring together these kind of questions around public attitudes and genomics and data, is just to start off with a question for you. So if you were asked to donate your anonymous DNA and medical information into a database, would you do that? Would you do it for use by doctors? Would you do it for use by university researchers? would you do it for use by company researchers? And I think Em's going to open a poll now. So I'd be really interested in what you think. And then if you could put in the chat maybe some thoughts on what kinds of things would shape your decision, shape your decision on that.
So it looks like so far, most people would be happy if it was a doctor or a university researcher, but a lot lower for a company researcher. So I wonder if anyone who's chosen one and not the other, if you could let us know in the chat, maybe why you picked one, or why maybe a company researcher sounds like a scarier group to donate your DNA to. Okay, so someone's put a really interesting idea that companies have many more ways of getting around regulations if they're not based in the UK. So you might be in the UK and used to UK laws, but if the company's based abroad, they might have different laws, and that's definitely really interesting. Someone said that they've already volunteered for such a study because they want to help find causes for certain health conditions, which is awesome to see. And then there's sort of a lot of comments that are sort of overlapping, but one person's written in a quite a nice way that a company researcher might be working for profit rather than for humanity at large. And I think that's that sort of might sum up a lot of views coming in the chat.
Yeah, I think so. And I think thanks. That's really useful. And I think that's what you find when we do these public attitude studies that we've done and that other people have done, that this comes out, that there is this that generally, it's partly about motives and it's partly about oversight. How do you know that a company's doing what you say, whereas you might feel that a university or an academic research is more monitored. And then this question of trust, I think, that I'm going to come back to later. I love the question as well about whether you can have anonymous DNA, and it's a fantastic question that I mean, ultimately the answer is probably not in many ways, but you can do a lot of work to de-identify it. So if you look, so what I'll show you is the results. So this is it's good that everybody didn't go completely the opposite direction, because otherwise it would make this slide a bit more difficult to explain. But when we looked across our 22 different countries, we essentially found that most people, more than half of people in most countries were willing to donate to make their data available to doctors and to non-profit researchers, but that in most countries, when it came to for-profit research, it dropped off. And we're not the only people to have found this, that generally it's people aren't as willing to donate their data. So before I come back to this, and before this question of trust, what I want to do is to spend a bit of time thinking about why we might want this data in the first place. What's the importance of gathering data from all these people? And so this is a kind of story that runs from genomes, from a genome to multiple genomes, and to talk about why we want to collect data, make it available to different researchers, and why this is not just a scientific concern, but why it's also a question of ethics and society. And so it's a story that starts, as a lot of stories around genomics do, with the Human Genome Project. So for those people, if you haven't come across the Human Genome Project before, it is one of the the great scientific endeavors of the last century. It's up there with the Manhattan Project and the space program, as this nearly 20-year, the main project was 13 years, but overall it ran for about 20 years of this international research effort to work out what the genes were that made up a human. And it cost nearly $3 billion. It was this huge international collaboration and involved nearly 3,000 researchers. And when it was published, it made the front pages of the two major scientific journals in the world, as well as every newspaper probably around the world, as far as I'm aware anyway. That finally this code had been written out, and at the Wellcome Genome campus we actually have a printed copy of the books, which I think is like 24, 26, 30 volumes, or big volumes of books, and just filled with the letters A, G, C, and T. So this, and one of the things that this project did was show this, kind of illustrate the similarity of all humans, that 99% of us are the same. But what it also did is flag up the interesting fact that, all the differences between us, all the biological differences and genetic differences between us, fall into a very small part of the genome. And so that what we've spent a lot of time doing since then is trying to understand this variation, understand how people are different, how different differences interact with each other, and how we might use our understanding of those differences to make better understanding of who we are. So whether that's understanding, what is it that genetically influences whether somebody is tall or somebody isn't, why some people are morning people or why some people aren't morning people, or particularly probably more attention than the morning people question has been questions of why some people develop diseases. Why do some people develop heart disease, cancer, or dementia, and other people don't? And can we make meaningful predictions about that? Can we identify people who are maybe most at risk and do something to help them to stop that risk? And so over the last decade, really, this has got easier, because if you look at this graph down at the bottom, the cost of producing genomic data has plummeted massively. So it cost, overall, this estimate from the US National Human Genome Institute is that to sequence a whole genome in 2001 cost around $100 million. Yeah. By 2020, this is less than $1,000. So you can now go online and you can pay to have your genome sequenced in its entirety. And that's something that's available to everybody, not just kind of Elon Musk. So that it's and not only that, you don't have to wait 13 years for that to be sequenced. It takes a matter of days. So if you, this is as I mentioned, at the Sanger and at EBI, we do a lot of data work, and so 1 petabase of data is 9 million gigabytes. Apparently, it's the same amount of data that's held on about 70,000 iPads. And it took nearly 20 years for the first petabase of DNA to be sequenced at the Sanger. It now takes about 35 days. So there's been this exponential increase in speed that's made it much easier, quicker, and cheaper to generate huge amounts of genomic data to really kind of map this human variation. The other thing, though, and it was interesting seeing some people mention this in the chat, is that there's been a huge buy-in from people who've been taking part in all of this research as research participants, either as just members of the population or because they're recruited into research studies through hospitals or clinical trials and things like that. And one of the biggest ones is hosted in the UK, so that's called UK Biobank, and that includes genetic and health data from over 500,000 people. The UK is also currently in the process of setting up a new study, which is called Our Future Health. And the aim there is to include genetic data, not full genetic sequences, but at least some genetic data from around 5 million people. So there is a huge kind of acceleration and scale up of this. And somebody else, I think in the chat, mentioned 23andMe. And these kind of, you've also had the emergence of these consumer genetic testing companies, which, you get back your genetic test, you get back your ancestry information, they get huge quantities of data that they can then use for research. So what do they do with this? So I put this slide in. I'm not a bioinformatician, I'm not a geneticist, so I don't really understand these slides. But what I can say is that it shows when you put those hundreds of thousands of genomes together, genetic tests together. So this is you can see what genes, what sites in the genome on different chromosomes, the bits that make up the genome, which of those red dots are, which of those dots are those that might be having an effect? And if you put all of those together, you might be able to make a better prediction. So this is from a paper from 2017 from a research article that looked at 100,000 people from UK Biobank, 90,000 people from 23andMe, and basically looked at the link between their genome and whether they said they were a morning person or not. And it said, and so it kind of suggesting that there was some ability to detect genes that might affect how you feel during the day, which as everybody knows, it's your biology has a huge impact on how you feel in the morning, how late you like to stay up at night. And So you can kind of map that at a genomic level, which is really interesting. But the question is, what does that, I mean, whether you're a morning person or not, what does that have to do with ethics and society? And at a morning person level, I'm not convinced that it has a huge amount to do with ethics. And so, but before I start answering that question, what I want to do is to think about what we mean by ethics. And it's this question of, is this something that, what should we do? And how do we think about what it is that we should do? And I think, if I'd given this talk a couple of years ago, I'd be finding examples that were fairly obscure and that some people might go, oh yeah, I saw a bit about that. The last year has meant that topics around ethics and medicine and new medical science have been absolutely everywhere around us. And so I've got a couple of examples. And again, so I just want the first example is the use of mobile phone, cell phone data to track people, to see whether they've been in contact with somebody who's had a positive test for coronavirus. And so lots of countries have introduced contact tracing apps where you add it to your phone and then it can use the Bluetooth. In Israel, they initially early in the pandemic used a system that was developed for counterterrorism to track mobile phone signals where people were connecting to the network. So it wasn't something that you opted in or out of. It just meant that they could track kind of basically anybody who'd been in contact with. So the question is, do you think that was ethical, or do you think that was not ethical? And again, if you could put in the chat, some of your thinking about why, that would be great.
We've got another poll, which is very much like it's either okay or not okay, but I know a lot of people will probably feel nearer the middle. So pick which one you think you lean towards slightly further, and then pop any thoughts you have around that in the chat box. We're pretty split. We're at 55-45%. And now we've just swapped. So we were on more okay, and now we're on more not okay, but it's very, very split, which doesn't surprise me. And someone's put a very good comment that it wouldn't be a problem if they knew about it, but it being a secret maybe is sort of part of the problem, that if it was just rolled out without public knowledge, then that's maybe not great. But then someone else has pointed out that maybe ethics should be for the greatest betterment of society, not the individual. So yeah, there's definitely some mixed opinions coming in.
Okay, I mean, I think that's it's a good illustration of the fact that, I mean, so many of these discussions that we've had over the last years have not been black or white. They've been really people have taken very opposing positions on them often. And so I'm going to come back. So the second one that I want to talk about. So I had a different clipping, and then I went on the news just before I came on. And I mean, this is literally being discussed in the UK Parliament this afternoon. And it's this question of whether people should have vaccine passports that should allow people to be able to do certain things. Like in the UK at the moment, it's the discussion about whether you should be able to go to the pub or go to the cinema without being able to show proof of vaccination. So again, do you think vaccine passports on this would be okay or not okay?
Looks like at the moment this one's less split than the last, so more think it's ethical than unethical, by a fair margin, about sort of 70-30. So a lot more, more obvious split than the last one.
That's that's interesting. I think we'll have to pass on the findings to the UK government immediately. But no, I mean, and I think there's some really important points about. I think somebody said that there's it's the importance of some people having had the opportunity to have the vaccine, and this is the kind of question that what if people haven't had that opportunity? Which if I move on, because I think what everybody's answers did, and there was some absolutely fantastic answers coming out in the chat, because I think that what it kind of shows is that, and you see this in discussions of genetics and discussions of medical ethics, that where you start from very much takes you, depends on where you end up. So there are two particularly, I mean, there are a lot of ways of thinking about ethics, but two have really dominated thinking over, well, I mean, the last couple of centuries, if not the last 3,000 years. So I was just really, getting distracted by the interesting things coming in the chat. But essentially, the two ways of thinking about, do you do the thing that has the best consequences for the greatest number of people, even if that requires some people to suffer a harm? So I think in the phone tracing idea, I think somebody mentioned this. It's okay if it's for the benefit of everybody, and so that sometimes you have to make the kind of sacrifices of something else. Or on the other hand, are there absolute sets of values that we do not compromise, whatever the potential benefits? So, for example, in that example, it might be the right to privacy, that you have a right to choose what people know about you, and that nobody has the right to take that away from you. And the example that I like to use, which is when I'm teaching and giving talks like this, is from a book by a philosopher called Mark White, who has written a series of books about Batman. But basically, he writes a really nice piece about consequentialists, these kind of first position, and the second one, the kind of idea of absolute set of value, the kind of absolute values. That if Batman has the opportunity, which he has many times throughout the Batman comics, to kill the Joker, he might take it if he were a consequentialist, because killing the Joker would save the people of Gotham City from all kinds of horrors in the future. But Batman very much takes the second position through most of it. That he has this absolute value that to kill the Joker would put him in the same camp as the Joker, and that do not kill is a fundamental law, fundamental ethical, moral law that can't be violated. So he doesn't. And the problem is that you end up in the situation with the chat where you have two camps, and it is very difficult to find a middle ground often between them. And so thinking so people working in biomedical ethics, so ethics related to medicine and biology, have tried to find kind of compromises. And one that's been very influential is coming down to 4 principles, that whenever you've got an ethical challenge, an ethical question, you try and work out how it relates to these 4 principles. So one is the right to self-determination, the idea that we all have the right to make decisions about ourselves. One is the importance of trying to do good, and it's flip the doing no harm. So that's the kind of Hippocratic oath that doctors take, that they will first do no harm. And then the last one, which I think comes back to this idea of the vaccine passports, is this question of justice. Who has access to these things? Is if you have vaccine passports, but people don't have, if they work by an app or something like that, and people don't have mobile phones, then how do you give them access? How do you make sure that people aren't excluded? And this is where I come back to genetics and human genetic variation. So this is around this question of justice. So when the Human Genome Project was completed, then US President Bill Clinton and then UK Prime Minister Tony Blair gave a joint press conference, which was video linked. In those days, it was much more unusual to be video linked rather than it being how we all live our lives. And they both pulled out this question in their speech, this issue of justice. So Bill Clinton, for example, talked about how, one of the things that the Human Genome Project showed was that the most important fact of life on Earth is our common humanity, that we were all in some way equal. And then Tony Blair pulled out a second part of this kind of justice question, that not only were we all the same, but we all had a responsibility to make these advances work for all of our people in all of our countries for the common good of all humankind. That it wasn't just that we were all equal, but that we had to do something to make that equality matter. And so where have we kind of come to from there? So it leaves us with, so we come to this question of, can genomics deliver equitable benefits? So is genomics currently just and fair, and how does it do that? How does it be that? But this is an article that was written 10 years ago now by a group of researchers at Stanford, pointing out that that aim of delivering genomics for the world was struggling because medical genomics has been focused, as they said, almost entirely on people of European descent. And to some extent, that's because that first wave of genomics research was funded and hosted, a lot of it in the UK, in the USA, in countries like Iceland and Northern Europe. And it meant that in terms of understanding this 1% of difference, that we're better at understanding it in some populations than we are in other populations. And this is reflected in the makeup of genomic data. So I got a couple of graphs, and these ones I do have a kind of clearer idea about what they mean than the dots everywhere, but showing the difference between the proportion of people within who've given data for genomics research who are of European ancestry versus those who are of East Asian ancestry, South Asian ancestry, African ancestry. And what you find is that the people of European ancestry are massively overrepresented in the genomic data sets as they stand. But because of the history of human migration, that this accounts for only a fraction of the diversity that makes up that 1% of difference. And if you're interested, there's a fantastic website, I put the address down at the bottom here, where you can look across different types of studies, different disease research areas. You can see how this has changed over time. And it is going down. So this proportion, the proportion that are of European ancestry populations within that data set is starting to decrease. But what it means is that those scores, like the morning person score, aren't equally predictive for everyone. So that morning person score, for example, was based only within the UK Biobank on people of European ancestry, because once you start to include multiple ancestry populations, the dots start to get even messier than they already are. So big genomic data isn't equally predictive for everyone. At the moment, there's a lot of interest in something called polygenic risk scores, which take all of that big data and they put it together into a score that may predict somebody's cardiovascular risk or their heart disease risk or their dementia risk. And if you look at, so this graph here shows you 1 is how good it is at predicting. If you take 1 as being how good it is at predicting in a European ancestry population, in other populations of different ancestries, it's not, those polygenic risk scores that give you these predictions of future health aren't as good as predicting. So there's a danger that we end up with these predictions that systematically perform better in people who are of European ancestry populations than others. And that given that those European ancestry populations are often those who have always had or who have already better funded health systems, better access to care and to scientific research, that's going to exacerbate existing inequalities, both within countries, because people of every ancestry live everywhere in the globe, and you're going to end up with exacerbating inequalities within countries, but also globally between countries. So this is the real kind of the real scientific, clinical, and ethical conundrum that is presented by human genetic variation and its place in and big data. And it's not gone unnoticed. As I mentioned, there was that article in 2011, and since then you've had 10 years of people recognizing that this is a real, I mean, and before that as well, but we recognize that this is a real issue. And so you have now a proliferation of efforts to collect genetic data around the globe, and also within countries. So the US, so the Our Future Health initiative that I mentioned, the 5 million people, is making is committed to making efforts to reach out within the UK to not just people of European ancestry, but to try and capture a richer picture of the UK population. the All of Us Precision Medicine Initiative in the United States, which is a 1 million person research project, is doing similar things. And then you have efforts such as the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, which is it's a global alliance for genomics and health research. It's not a very imaginative name, but their aim is to connect up all of these different projects to enable data to be shared, so that you can work in the UK with data from people in Qatar or Japan or China, that you can and that by putting this data together, we get a better picture of this human genetic diversity. But it also requires some of the work that that people like me and our team at Sanger do as well, because data isn't just a kind of policy issue. It's not just a scientific question. It's not just a technical question. It's also an ethical and social question. So many of you, I mean, through things like COVID apps and things like that, but also through the news over the last few years, data have become something that a lot of us think a lot about a lot of the time. Whether that's Cambridge Analytica and their influence on the 2016 US election, or Google and Amazon's potential access to health data. There's the suspicion often around data, particularly when it's being used by companies, which I think we saw at the beginning. And genomic data can be particularly sensitive. When we're thinking about the people who may not be well represented in existing genomic data sets, they're often people with valid contemporary and historical reasons not to trust those who are coming around asking them for blood or data. And so that part of this process of building genomic data that works for everybody is understanding what shapes people's willingness to make data available and what we can do in order to be more trustworthy. So final poll is this question. So coming back to this question of who you would donate to, and I'm not now asking who you would donate to, but who would you trust with your genetic information, which I think is this some people raised in the chat. Would you trust your own doctor? Would you trust any doctor in your country, a university scientist or a company scientist?
So I think the results are looking fairly similar to the first one. Most people would trust their own doctor and a university scientist, but it's a lot lower for any doctor in your country, which is interesting, or a company scientist. I'm surprised by the any doctor in your country being lower. For me, I don't feel like I usually know my specific doctor that well, so for me there wouldn't be a huge difference, but clearly other people might know their doctors a bit better.
And it's interesting because we've been talking to our collaborators, the people that we work with in India and the United States and Canada, particularly recently, and there's the, in your relationship with your own individual doctor very much varies country by country, and whether you feel that you have an individual doctor or you have your family's doctor, and how they relate to the health system. There
we go.
University scientists are coming out well. As a university scientist, I'm very pleased about that. Okay. Well, if you're interested, this is another question that we used in our survey, and if you're interested, you can take the whole survey. You can, if you go to the website of the Connecting Science, then you can go to our project pages and find all the results that we published. And you can also watch, we've got a series of videos that within this survey that explain more about genomic data and genomic, and why you do data sharing, who uses it and why. And so this is just, so I just pulled out the UK data. So from this, from our study, not across the whole 22 countries, because it gets very messy with all the different groups. But what we find is that generally people have very high levels of trust in, it is anonymized. That's your anonymized DNA data. But yeah, so sorry, just responding to the question in the chat. But yeah, so people generally say in the UK say they're very trusting of their own doctor. Just under half of people say they trust any doctor in their country. And what's interesting is that that's a lot higher in the UK than in many other countries. And we do have this kind of thing in the UK about the NHS and the kind of idea that you're treated not just by your doctor, but by the health system. And that I think this kind of feeds into it. And then, then trust in university researchers. And after that, it's it's quite a long way down, particularly once you start thinking not just in my country, but you start thinking about worldwide. And that's really important when we start thinking as well about, how do you share this data globally? How do you make sure it can move around? And what do you do about that? So that brings me to the end of I think what I want to talk about, and hopefully what I've given an idea of is this idea that genomic diversity and human genetic variation is really important from a social and ethical perspective in terms of ensuring that the benefits of genomics are fairly accessible. We need to be able to build kind of genomic medicine and the future of genetics and genomics. We need to collect and share data around the world, but in order to do that in a way that's ethical and that achieves its kind of scientific goals as well, we need to understand and respond to what people's concerns are about it and build trust. So it means being transparent about how we're collecting and using data. It means letting people know what we're doing with it. If you give me your data, then it's about like who, or give me data about you, not your data, but it's what am I using it for? Who am I sharing it with? What qualifications, what authority do I have to use that data? It means talking to communities about how that can be managed, and it means working to share back the benefits, not just taking but giving back as well. So I hope that's been useful, and it's been, thank you for all the comments in the chat and the responses to the polls.
Awesome, thanks so much, Richard. If you will have questions about anything Richard was talking about, then feel free to put them in the chat box or in the Q&A, and we'll try and sort of get through a couple. There was definitely a lot of interesting thoughts that were coming in as we were talking about sort of trust and stuff. One question that came up in the Q&A area was, why would you want to pay to map your whole genome if relatively few people understand the significance of the entire data?
That is an excellent question, and one that has been So I mean, partly I think that the idea of paying to map your genome is partly an appeal of knowing something about yourself, or having information about yourself that maybe you didn't have before. But then again, there's the question of what actually does it allow you to know? You can use that data. So some of it will be interpreted for you. Some of it will, you can find out what type of, from 23andMe at least, you can find out what type of earwax you have. You can find out how likely you are to flush if you drink alcohol, and various things like that that are kind of, I would say interesting. I'm not entirely convinced. But then you can also, in theory, if you have your whole genome, you can take it to services where it will allow you to play with it and interpret it in terms of things like these polygenic risk scores.
Yeah, I think when the human genome was first sequenced, I think scientists and people in general thought it would solve a lot of questions, and I think actually it just produced more questions than answers. So I think, that idea of just knowing that bit more about yourself, I think, is definitely appealing to some people. There's lots of good questions coming in. Someone's asked, and I think this sort of relates to specifically giving genetic information, will it always be made clear who or what companies will have access to genetic information if you give your data to one specific group? So I don't know how much you know about how data is shared, but if you do, sounds like someone would like to know.
So it the overall answer is it depends. So everybody who gives their genetic data or takes part in a research study has to go through the informed consent process. And so within that in order to take part in research, you have to have received the information that allows you to decide whether you want to take part. So what it might do is say we will share this data only with academic researchers, or it might say we will share this with researchers who are what's called bona fide, so people who are known to be kind of valid researchers in this area, or it might say we'll share it with companies, but not necessarily which companies, because people might not know. I mean, this is one of the things about genetic data, is that when I or anybody else, collects data, I don't do a lot of genetic data collection actually, but yeah, were I to, I don't know what value that's going to have in 5 years, 10 years. I don't know if it's going to be, if I give my data at the moment, it might not be kind of hugely useful for, say, research into something that a condition that people develop in their 80s or something. When I'm in my 70s or 80s, suddenly that data might become very interesting in terms of kind of Alzheimer's research or something like that. But I don't know, but they don't necessarily know that now. So it can be very difficult to say how research is going to be used in the future. What you can do is say who will be making those decisions and how those decisions will be made, so that you have some confidence in who. So if it was 10 researchers from some small company who seem to be selling off data for some dodgy purposes, then they might not be the best people to be making a decision. If it's a kind of reputable kind of academic and large companies and people who have a lot at stake and a lot of expertise, then it might be, then you might have more confidence in it.
Also, there's a really good question that's come up sort of relating to what you're talking about in terms of a lot of the genetic data that we have is related to people of European ancestry. So someone's asked, as genetic testing has sampled a broader range of the global population, has there been any assumptions based on the initial sample of mainly European ancestry that has been upset? So I want, yeah, if any assumptions were suddenly blown out of the water when testing was sort of globalized more.
I think there's an example, I can't remember the specific, it's kind of one of those 5-letter number genetic names of a gene, but there was an example of a gene that was associated with heart disease risk, that was thought to be, based on the data collected primarily from Europeans, was thought to be quite strongly associated with heart disease risk. And when in the initial studies that have been done in kind of, or some of the studies that have been done through a project called the 1,000 Genomes Project, which is trying to capture a better picture of human genetic variation, that variant, that gene, is present quite widely in Africa with no association with severe heart disease. So there's a kind of question about, if you look in a European ancestry population, you tend to find things that are quite clearly associated with things in a European ancestry population. The question is, when you go into a different population, are they still there, and do they still appear to do the same thing? So that would be one example.
And obviously that's then really important in terms of medicine, right? That if we're presuming that this gene causes heart disease or anything else, and we're trying to provide medicine for that, and actually in a different population that gene has no effect, then you might need quite a different medicine or treatment. Someone's asked sort of in terms of the ethical data sharing side of stuff, whether genetic data could be used against you by like your life insurance company, and this is definitely something I've seen lots in the news about lately.
Yeah, so I mean, it has been one of the concerns around genetic data ever since people started thinking about genetic testing. And so in the UK, at least, so many genetic tests are protected under an agreement between insurance companies that they won't use that data in terms of calculating premiums and things. In the US, different types of genetic data are protected differently under there's a legal framework called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which protects certain types of genetic information from being used in making health and life insurance decisions, as well as in employment and things like that.
I think what I've seen more of at the moment is I've seen lots of adverts for health insurance places that are offering like a free Fitbit, and that your Fitbit, kind of in the same way as anyone in the UK who has like a black box in their car, the idea being the better you drive, the cheaper your insurance gets, that if you wear your Fitbit and sort of prove that you've been out running every day, that your health insurance could come down. So I think in terms of sort of data access and insurance and stuff, I think that's a more likely thing to watch out for than genetic data sharing, at least in the UK anyway.
And interestingly, because that same company I understand it tried to launch its service in Germany, and it failed to get any market in Germany because people were just not willing to share that level of data about themselves. Whereas in the UK, everybody's kind of, well, yeah, go for it. So it's, it very much does vary country by country depending on your the kind of how people feel about privacy and its importance.
There's been a couple of questions sort of linking to like police or crime use. So there was one about what is your opinion about using crime data and tracing it back to individuals who might have submitted their data to something like 23andMe, and another about genetic data being used by the police. I don't know if you've got any insight to anything crime related.
So the example of the data being traced back to 23andMe is a really interesting one. It's so there was the case which was quite widely reported a few years ago of the Golden Gate killer, who was I think a serial killer in California in the 1970s, 1980s, who was identified from DNA of a family member which had been uploaded to a public ancestry database, which was then kind of accessed by, I think it was by the FBI, and he was identified from that. So there is, so it's a similar question in some ways to the ability of companies like Apple or Google to be able to, whether they should be compelled to make their data available to law enforcement. I think in general, I think genetic testing companies say that they won't make it available as part of their terms and conditions. But if they're forced to, then they'll inevitably have to, because of the kind of concerns about privacy. But also, if people are willing to share that information, then it'll be shared. One of the things that's interesting about the Golden State killer was the fact that it wasn't their own data, it was somebody else's. And this is one of the things about genetics, is that it doesn't have to be us who've uploaded our DNA to kind of potentially have implications for our privacy. I think that the estimate in the US was that if 25 million people in the United States had had genetic testing, that it essentially meant that 25 million could be used to pretty much identify anybody else who's, if somebody's DNA was found, that they would be able to be traceable to somebody who was related to them. So it doesn't have to be somebody, it doesn't have to be you, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that many people to have implications for everybody's privacy.
I think that links back to what you were saying about if you gave your if you gave your DNA, and it might not be very interesting right now, but down the line it might be if you've developed whatever condition. I feel like there's a similarity in that the minute you've given it over, it can be quite difficult to get back, but you don't actually know what the implications down the line might be if a family member did get caught up in a criminal investigation, which, unlikely as it might sound, your data then is more than just about you. It's about more than just you. Just sort of trying to look through the chat and see if we've missed anything else. Someone slightly earlier asked, what do you think about sort of Costal benefits of governments having, like, everyone having their genome sequenced, specifically like whether newborns should get their genome sequenced at birth?
So I think that the issue with, because there's been some talk about this in the UK, of whether this is a direction that we should be heading. I think one of the issues, I think, as always, is what it would be used for. It's potentially valuable to have that data available to you throughout your life, in order to kind of inform your healthcare. It's also, though, because of this ability to use it in predictive terms, then how do you define what types of prediction are those which are acceptable? I mean, there's not that much value probably at birth of finding that you have a high risk of developing Alzheimer's disease in your 70s. Whereas other forms of risk information may be more useful. So how do you, if you do that sequencing, then how do you decide when's the best time in somebody's life to give them that information? And that's something that you've already seen in discussions around around Huntington's testing. When does so testing for severe genetic conditions, like when do you give people that information? When should people have access to that information? The other issue with things like with kind of sequencing of newborns as well is that it potentially extends not just beyond health. I mean, there's a lot of interest in how, well, there has been a lot of discussion of how might you use things like polygenic risk scores, these kind of putting together all these pictures of different bits of the genome to make predictions about somebody's education, somebody's educational success, or their ability to learn. And how do you, so what do you do with that information if you generate it? So I think I think whole genome sequencing of newborns opens up a big ethical can of worms. It also opens up a kind of clinical and kind of worms as well, because in the sense that interpreting genetic test information is often part of a process of working with somebody's family history as well. So it's, if you have a strong family history of disease, then it makes it much more straightforward to interpret the genetic information. If you don't, then you're not quite sure whether there's some interaction between the genes, whether that gene will ever have an effect, or that genetic makeup will ever have an effect.
Awesome. There was a question a little bit earlier as well that was sort of more related to the slides that you were showing, that I've now lost, but I will find again.
I can put them back here.
Someone asked, any idea why people in India trust company researchers more than university researchers? And I guess more broadly, have you found anything from that survey, any particular countries that stand out in terms of a different trend in trust, and why that might be?
Yeah, so India has been a question that's been, it's been a country that we spent a lot of time thinking about. So we have some collaborators who work with us in Hyderabad, and they're one of the things that they've talked about is the relationship between public and private healthcare in India, and so potentially the fact that over a period of time, private healthcare and private medical research has often been seen as potentially higher quality than the public sector, and that might affect it. But no, I mean, this is so I do two types of research. I do one type, which is these kind of big surveys where you ask people questions and you get big numbers and you get to draw nice graphs. And the other part is talking to people in interviews and in focus groups and in these kind of, going to people's homes and talking to them about their lives and things. And that the surveys give you these really interesting kind of pictures and say, oh, there might be something really interesting going on here. To actually work out what's going on, you often have to go and start talking to people and getting that more, that kind of nuanced detail. So.
Great, yeah, and it'll be different for every country based on a whole lot of stuff. So it won't be a very quick answer.
Yeah. on the differences, we looked at a question around like, what is it that would increase your trust? Got 10 options and a list, and like which of these would increase your trust, and then we looked at how those rank different countries. So which was the most important, which was the least important, and basically we found that about 19 countries had roughly the same ordering, and then we had 20 countries had roughly the same ordering, and then we found that in China and Russia the list came out quite differently. So that's something that we're trying to work out what to do with at the moment, trying to work out where we go with that and what it means.
Awesome. That brings us perfectly up to 5:30, so we'll wrap up there. In the chat box, I'm going to pop a few links that includes the email address that you can get in contact with us on. If we couldn't get to your question this evening, do feel free to email and I can get in contact with Richard and see if we can get some answers. Although for these sorts of questions, the answers usually aren't particularly straightforward, as we've seen this evening. That was the last in our series on human genetic variation. We'll be starting a new series about cancer research after the Easter holidays. If anyone was interested in getting a certificate of participation for this series, fill out the feedback form that will pop up at the screen at the end, but it's also in the chat box. And if anyone wants to win a textbook about genomics, there's another survey. You can literally just enter your email address and you'll have a chance to win a textbook, which is pretty exciting. But thank you very much, Richard, for coming along. That was a really interesting talk this evening. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was great.